Well, good evening, church family. Glad that you've chosen to join us again for this video. Again, I say evening. Have no idea when you're watching this, but whenever you get a chance to sit down and work your way through this video, I'm glad that you've chosen to. We are continuing on in our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We are continuing on our conversation of discipleship. Unlike some previous recordings, what I've told you I was going to try and work fast and then end up taking as much time as I usually do, this current video, stop using timestamps, is going to be a little bit shorter because I do still have a small child in that other room, and it's taken me a little bit longer to get to recording today than usual. And he hasn't had lunch. He's currently distracted enough that I think I can get away with this, but I can't push my luck too far. So enjoy a little bit shorter of a video tonight. Again, dadgum timestamps. Enjoy a little bit shorter video this time. And yeah, there we go. We're continuing on in Matthew chapter 8. I realize at this exact moment that I failed to change the verses right there. So we can go ahead and make a quick adjustment here. We actually, I think, ended up going through 18 or through 17 last time, so I think tonight's 18 through 34 or something along those lines. Although really, what I want to spend my time with this evening is kind of the key hinge verse in this passage. In order to set that up, I want to share with you the quote that I've written on the board tonight from Oscar Romero. He said, "To believe means to hand oneself over. It is not simply a matter of the head. Believing is not just something theoretical. Believing is an act of the will." And I didn't have space to put the rest of what he was writing up on the board, but what he talks about is devoting one's whole self to the work and mission and purpose of Christ. And I think that's an important consideration all throughout Matthew, certainly in a conversation about discipleship, and especially so in the passage that we are looking at this evening. So continuing on in chapter 8, starting in verse 18, I got it right now that I've corrected it. "When Jesus saw the crowds around him, he instructed his disciples to cross over to the other side of the lake." And I just think that's an important starting point for conversation. Getting a crowd was never Jesus' primary goal. And this becomes more obvious in Mark's gospel. Matthew dials it back a little bit. But Jesus in Mark's gospel, as soon as crowds begin to develop, they're showing up for the healing and the miracles, and he immediately leaves and goes somewhere else because, I think the way Mark writes, they're there for the wrong reasons. Matthew has a little bit more nuanced conversation around that point, because what happens next in this story is the only two times in this stretch of teachings and miracles where somebody comes to Jesus and is challenged. Not rejected, not turned away, but challenged. One of the teachers of religious law, verse 19, comes to him, says to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens to live in, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to even lay his head." And another of his disciples said, "Lord, first let me run home and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me now, let the dead bury their own dead." And then Jesus got into a boat, started across the lake with his disciples. Suddenly, a fierce storm struck by the lake, with waves breaking onto the boat, but Jesus was sleeping. Then the disciples went and woke him, shouting, "Lord, save us, we are going to drown." And I actually want to pause in our reading for this evening right there. Because there are a number of things just in these first few verses I think worth taking a moment to talk about. One, the two people who come to him that experience the challenges that Jesus gives are people who you would think would know that discipleship is costly. One is a teacher of religious law, and the Torah, of which he would have been a teacher, is pretty stern in its instruction on how you should live towards those who are around you. We tend to, as Christians in the modern world, think of the law as this like strict rote set of rules that nobody could ever possibly follow, and that's why God gives us Jesus, is to fix what went wrong the first time. And that's a really bad reading. One, it assumes that the law is bad, which means what we're saying is that God created something in the law that was always destined to fail, and that's not a great reading of the law. And two, it assumes that the law is all about the rules, but the law was supposed to create a particular type of compassionate, just, loving community. And we know that, one, by reading the law, and two, by reading the prophets, who then point back to the law and said, just see what this was trying to get you to do? You're not doing it. That's the problem. And so, as somebody who is well versed in the law, this person sees something in Jesus that points in the right direction. He doesn't proclaim him Lord, he calls him teacher, but there's something about Jesus' teaching that draws him in. And so he comes to Jesus and says, I will follow you wherever you go. Jesus doesn't say, great. Jesus doesn't say, no. Jesus lets him know that following comes with a price. Foxes have dens to live in, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to even lay his head. Which may seem like a strange, mysterious teaching, but I would like to think that the person coming to Jesus understood what he meant. Nature provides space for the creatures that are in it, but the community in which Jesus is in is having a hard time making space for him. His experiences in his own hometown, certainly reflective of that. He experiences some rejection along the way. In fact, the story we're going to look at the end of the passage tonight highlights that. Jesus is letting him know that following him is not all about hearing nice teachings. Following him comes with a cost. And then you get the second one, which always comes across especially harsh. Another one of his disciples said, Lord, first let me return home and bury my father. This person is described as a disciple. This is somebody who is a follower of Jesus, who is ready to go to the other side of the lake with him, at least contextually. That's how I think Matthew is making this. He's ready to go to the other side. He's ready to follow, but his dad just died, or her dad. We don't get a real clear description here. Just passed away. In the tradition of the time, burial would have taken place immediately. So the way that this reads, the way that Matthew shares this story, is that this is a person who is with Jesus essentially the day of his father's death. And he's saying, I need to go bury my father, and then I'm with you. If you know your Old Testament well, this evokes some memory here. When Elijah comes off of Sinai, having just had his encounter with God, he's been sent to find Elisha. Elisha is going to be the next prophet. He is going to mentor under Elijah. And when Elijah finds Elisha, Elisha's response is to go back and say bye to his family. And so what you see here, in even more stark terms, is a teaching from Jesus that says, genuine discipleship reorders your priorities on every level. Now, I don't think for a second that what Jesus is teaching here is that in order to follow Christ most fully, you have to completely abandon your family. Because there are plenty of other moments in Scripture where Jesus reminds us of the importance of family. And he calls the Pharisees to task over their abuse of their parents by declaring sacred and allowing them to store aside stuff that should have been used for their family. So it's not that. Instead, it is a parable is not the right word, but both of these encounters form a narrative that tells us about the cost and the priority that following Jesus both has and the place that it should have in our lives. And so then, for those who are willing to follow, disciples get into the boat. Verse 23. Then Jesus got into the boat and started across the lake. Which means those who are with Jesus have heard both of these teachings and are following along. They understand the cost, or they think they do at the very least. They are willing to say, Jesus, you are the priority. And they begin to work their way across the lake. And then that fierce storm hits. And this is always an interesting story because I want to give the disciples way more credit than Jesus does. Because they go to Jesus in the way that Matthew tells this passage, it seems like, with the understanding that Jesus can do something about it. They say, Lord, save us, we are going to drown. Which means that at least on some level, they believe Jesus can do something about it. They're not looking at each other, trying to figure out which of them is going to provide salvation. They recognize that things are going poorly. And even the nature of this storm. Translations try to describe it as a fierce storm or something or other. But the literal word in the Greek, seismos, is really more like an earthquake. It's like the ocean, the Sea of Galilee, the lake, is experiencing an earthquake. It is so rough and so crazy and so chaotic. Jesus responds when they wake him up in a rather grumpy fashion, which to me is just what happens when you are awoken, when you want to be asleep. Why are you so afraid? You have so little faith. And then he got up and rebuked the winds and waves, and suddenly there was a great calm. And the disciples were amazed. And this is a question statement. They're not expecting an answer to the question. They're amazed, and these are the words that come out of their mouths. Who is this man? And that is a thematic question for Matthew. Because so much of what the Gospel of Matthew is answering for the community to which he writes down, records these stories, and shares them with is who is Jesus? Why is Jesus worth following? And why does it make a difference in my life? And so the disciples on the boat, in the water, even with enough faith of some sort to ask Jesus for help in their moment of crisis, are amazed at what happens. And so, again, I don't know what their expectations were. I want to give them a lot of credit, but they are, in this moment, blown away by a man who's obeyed by the wind and the waves. And I want to take a moment before we look at the last section of our verses tonight to talk about how I think Matthew is using this story. Because, again, Mark records the story, Matthew records the story, and they're recorded in different ways, and the emphasis seems to be a little bit different. And I think Matthew is doing something specific here with this story for his church community to which he writes, which adds another layer of application, I think, for us today. Because in the ancient world, the water in general was seen as a place of chaos, of evil in some ways, and a place outside of control. And so by giving these images and Jesus' words in this story, Matthew is offering some assurance to his own community, which is in the midst of a chaotic and difficult, life-altering moment as a church. And Matthew is either reminding them or letting them know, or if they hear as well as the average kid does, telling them for the 37th time, hoping that they get it this time, that Jesus brings some calm to the chaos and has power over the evil and the chaos that exists in our lives. And then by asking that question, the way that it's worded, who is this man? Matthew is giving his readers a nudge, because as readers of the Gospel of Matthew, we know something that the disciples in this moment on that boat did not, and that is that he's the Son of God. They are learning as they go. And in fact, it's about to be proclaimed for the first time in a public fashion in Matthew's Gospel to the people who are around Jesus. And who it is proclaimed by brings us back, wrong way, to this conversation that we've been having about discipleship. So we started in 5 through 7 talking about discipleship. And then we begin asking questions in 8 about who can be a disciple. And we looked at a few categories of people, which I hate that phrase, but that's kind of how Matthew portrays these different individuals as types of a group. Can the unclean, can the Gentile, can the woman, can those who fear and doubt is where we're at in the story of the disciples on the boat. And then we get to the other side of the lake in verse 28. When Jesus arrived at the other side of the lake, in the region of the Gadarenes, my pronunciation is terrible, don't copy it. 2 men who were possessed by demons met him. They came out of the tombs and were so violent that no one could go through that area. They began screaming at him, "Why are you interfering with us, Son of God? Have you come here to torture us before God's appointed time?" There happened to be a large herd of pigs in the distance, so the demons begged, "If you cast us out, please send us into that herd of pigs." "All right, go," Jesus commanded them. So the demons came out of the men and entered the pigs, and the whole herd plunged down the steep hillside and into the lake and drowned in the water. So here's Jesus on the other side of the lake, near some tombs, another one of those places kind of known for an evil vibe, if I can use that phrase, in the ancient world. Not a place people regularly went. And even more so in this case, there are these 2 demon-possessed men that are so violent that the whole area has kind of become off limits to the people of the region. That's how this is portrayed to Matthew's readers. And then enters Jesus. It was one thing, but here comes this moment of crisis, and what they scream at him, if you notice, is, "Have you come here? Why are you interfering with us, Son of God?" So the question has just been asked by the disciples on the lake, "Who is this man?" And it has now been answered by 2 demons in a cemetery, "Son of God." And that's kind of the crux moment. This is the first time in Jesus' ministry that this is revealed in a public fashion. It's not to large crowds. And we interestingly don't really know what happens to these 2 men after this moment. We don't know if they become followers. We don't know if they go back to their lives the way that they've always known them. We don't know if they also are run out of the city and have to go start new on their own. All of that is completely off the table and not important as far as Matthew's concerned for trying to get his point across. Instead, what matters is that the demons have answered the disciples' questions about who this man is, and that Jesus has shown up in this powerful way in revealing himself as the Son of God. What it means to be a disciple, then, is to recognize who Jesus is and invest fully in living after, living like, living in his name. That's it. That's discipleship in a nutshell. All along the way here, too, we've been watching people's responses to Jesus, right? So with the man who has leprosy, who seeks Jesus out in the crowd and begs for help, with the Roman centurion who seeks Jesus out and begs for help, for Peter's mother-in-law, who after being healed by Jesus immediately begins to serve, like that being a key phrase there in the passage, for these 2 that would proclaim to follow Jesus. But we don't know how they respond to recognizing that there is a cost. And we're not supposed to know their response. We're supposed to ask ourselves the same question. Am I willing to put Jesus in that place in my life? Or do I have other priorities that are greater to me at this moment in time? The disciples, are they going to believe? Are they going to doubt? Are they going to wonder? Are they going to ask and leave questions unanswered? And then to these 2 demon-possessed, basically the demons is who we get the conversation with. It's not even the men. It's the demons who then go ruin a lot of really good bacon, which is sad for us, but great for Jesus' Jewish audience here. But then the last response in this section of Scripture comes from the entire town. Verse 38, the herdsmen who watched this happen fled to the nearby town, telling everyone what had happened to the demon-possessed men. The entire town came out to meet Jesus, but they begged him to go away and leave them alone. So again, in all of these stories, I think the reason Matthew has condensed them together and told them together is because they ask questions about how we will respond to Jesus, what our priorities are, and whether or not Jesus will be our priority. You get people who follow. You get people who want to follow but have other things going on in their lives. And you get people who see and don't want anything to do with it because it scares them. And I think all of those are places that it's very easy for us nowadays as people to find ourselves. And the reason I think these are important questions for Matthew's audience, for the church community he wrote this down for, is because they're in the same boat. They are challenged. There is a crisis in the church community where they no longer feel like they fit where they always have. Jewish men and women who believe that God has sent the Messiah, who has been long promised and long awaited, trying to continue on in life in a Jewish community that doesn't believe. And the crisis that comes with that, and the questions of whether or not Jesus is truly worth following. Who is Jesus anyway? So Matthew writes, genuine discipleship, essentially in all of these stories, can be found anywhere if you correctly identify who Jesus is. And it's not just about identifying, as our quote from Oscar Romero here shows. It's about then acting on what you believe. To take on the life of a disciple as outlined in the Sermon on the Mount as lived by Jesus. And once is not the only time we have to answer that question. This is ongoing. This is something that disciples have to choose over and over and over again. And the challenge for us is to correctly identify Jesus and then make Jesus a priority. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap things up for this particular video. Glad that you joined us. Whenever you are choosing to watch this, we will pick up with chapter 9 next week. Y'all have a good one.